Yeah. It's is that on? Is that coming through? Yes. Yeah. Softly, but softly and tenderly, the microphone is calling for you and for me. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. I've got this too. Yeah. And I think it's front and back. Yeah. Do you want me to run make a copy of that for you? Yeah, I'll do that. Let me run make a copy. Okay, thanks. Okay. All right. How's that? Is that coming through okay? I mean, I have a big stentorian voice anyway, but how's that? There we go. Okay. Just a little amelioration for the room. How about that? I know, I can't help it. Ooh, tell you what. Jeff, can we get that wheelie cart of prayer books? Can we get the wheelie cart that's got the prayer books on it? Yeah. That's right. That's right. Good job. I haven't. He'll be up here eventually. I haven't seen him yet, but oh look, hey, but look. I told you there would be hot chocolate back again. You're welcome. Thank you, Jeff. All right. Very good. Great. Yeah. Yeah. We have some artifacts, not artifacts. Tactile learning. I know it is. Okay. Yeah, it's supposed to be. Yeah. I know. I was encouraging the mingling. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am. Did you get one? All right. You're welcome. You ready? Me too. Hey, listen, this is the good stuff. That's right. And this we know to be true. Oh no! Why did that happen? Is it because I moved the computer 2 feet? Probably not. All right. I don't know why that happened. Let's try it again. All right. Okay, we're back. So if it goes out again, just hoot and holler. There we go.
There we go. We're going to be using the prayer books this morning, so if you want to grab one from the cart, or there's a few here, or if you just have it memorized, you know.
Although our challenge to you this morning is we may be digging into a part of the book, the one part of the book that you might not have memorized.
But well, I guess we could talk about this later.
Yeah, we'll get into it.
Is it the point of a catechism is that you would memorize it?
Yeah.
Like, aren't there other types of churches that memorize it? Like,
we'll talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know, yeah. Like, you can really blame the leadership on that one. Well, we could go ahead and get started. I know folks will start to kind of trickle in gradually through the morning, but welcome. This is a one-off class. We are not doing a series here. This we know to be true, the beliefs of the Episcopal Church. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Catechism. And to get into that, I'm interested in just hearing your thoughts. What are the beliefs of the Episcopal Church? We're going to make a bullet point list. Beliefs of the Episcopal Church. A good way to think about this is, if you think about St. Paul's, I'm going to move this closer. If you think about St. Paul's, you think about where you have been to church throughout your life in the Episcopal Church. What are some of the things that if we changed them, it would make this place unrecognizable, belief-wise? Call them out. Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What else? If we didn't have donuts. Perfect. Yep. It would be unrecognizable if we didn't have... No, I think around here it has to be Krispy Kreme. Like, no. Like, if I was like, I'll be the donut girl and I'll pick up the donuts, and I went to Dunkin' Donuts, people would be like, heresy! We can't do this. What else? What are some of the beliefs of the Episcopal Church? Yes. Individual conscience. Can you just say one more sentence about that? Did I get that right? The Bible helps us work out our own understanding. Yes, Scott. Inclusion. That's right. Yep. And we worship together rightly. Would you like to say one more sentence about what you mean by rightly? Okay. Yes. As we worship, so we believe, right? Yes. It is Eucharist-centered. It's on the first page of the prayer book. And common cup. Yep. And that's a liturgical symbol, to not have all the little tiny cups, but to have one cup, one unity in the sacrament. Yes, Daniel? Conformist tradition. What does that mean? We can do more together than we can do alone. I missed the second part of that sentence. But that sounds pretty good to me. So, any other beliefs of the Episcopal Church that make us who we are? If we changed any of this stuff, it would make St. Paul's, but the Episcopal Church proper, unrecognizable. Okay, she said she was reading an article that talked about how Jesus' role in relationship to us. Someone said Jesus is meant to be followed, and this person also said Jesus is meant to be obeyed. Is that fair to say that Jesus is Lord? Jesus is actually God, right? And so that we follow Jesus, we also obey him as Lord. Yeah. And I would kind of put that front and center, like, Jesus. Because I think there are some Episcopalians out there that are sort of like, you don't need Jesus. Like, we're all about just being good people, and we just think Jesus is a wonderful teacher, and he's like my friend and like my buddy. But like, how I understand the doctrine of the Episcopal Church is that Jesus is Lord. Like, he's not just your buddy. He is your buddy, of course, but he's God. You know, he's to be followed. He is to be obeyed. He is to be worshipped. And that's pretty central for the Episcopal Church. Our Christology is pretty high. If anyone shared any of this, or if you are kind of thinking back, where did you first get these ideas about the Episcopal Church? And I know everybody in here has a different entry point to the Episcopal Church. Some of us grew up in this church. Some of us grew up Episcopalian. Maybe you joined from a different denomination. Where did you first absorb the beliefs of the Episcopal Church? Who were your teachers? Yeah, Jeannie. You had to memorize the Catechism and recite it back to the priest.
Jeannie
Here at
is
St.
not
Paul's?
a plant.
To get confirmed? Yeah. Okay.
I did not bribe her to say that. Promise.
You had to do that too. So you learned those beliefs from the Book of Common Prayer. Did anybody else have that? Is that a universal experience? No. It was your experience too? Was the Catechism? Yeah. 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 Receiving communion. Yeah. Yeah, that like Eucharist-centered part of it. Yeah. You get a donut. Yeah. Yeah. You should add that to the RSCM training for the kids.
That's right.
Yeah.
Answer these questions.
You're going to say something? Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Yeah, absolutely. And okay, so I got into a very interesting conversation with the young adults at small group on Thursday night where we were talking about prayer. And there are some people who connect to Jesus in prayer. Like that's the entity that you are thinking of when you pray. And there were several people in the room who were like, not me. I have to think of God, like God and God's mystery, in God's magnitude. That is my focus of prayer. And so we talked about how for some of us, there's kind of that like directional focus of you start with Jesus in order to get at God. Or you might start with God to get at Jesus. That like the focus of our prayer can kind of shift in different directions. Or you have a sense of the Holy Spirit in prayer, and that connects you to God or to Jesus. Like that it's like an avenue in prayer. Anyway, it's kind of interesting that way. Well, so we have been talking through the fall. Like, I don't know if y'all have noticed that our theme of the fall has been pilgrimage. Like, we've talked a lot about physical pilgrimage, how travel changes us, how different types of discipline in pilgrimage can shape us. We just finished this book study where we talked about searching for home. And this class today is not meant to be kind of just a shot in the dark, random, here we're talking about the Catechism. I see this as a continuation of what we have already covered in looking at our lives in faith, how we grow, how we develop as Christians. The Catechism is one tool for us to use on our pilgrimage in faith. It is meant to be kind of an anchor, a way for us to look at belief as something that can shape us and change us, much like pilgrimage does. So to talk about the Catechism specifically, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who I recruited to be part of this class, but you've wanted to teach on the Catechism for a while.
It's true. I will confess.
So,
yeah.
And our teaching style together has sometimes been in argument. So Lucy was saying at the church door that like they argue. You should come. It's going to be so fun. So I might push back on some of the things you have to say.
Of course.
As a person who both of us came to the Episcopal Church from another denomination. We did not grow up like some of y'all reading a catechism. And in fact, both of the denominations we come from do not use what's the plural? Catechesis. Didn't use those as we were growing up. So, this is new for both of us to have a relationship to a document like this. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark. I'll move this back so you can see the screen. To talk about what are we looking at in the book. What page do they need to turn to, Mark?
844 is a great page. And I do, as I talk, pardon me, I've got a little frog in my throat. I want you to keep these questions in the back of your mind as we're talking. And I'm going to do a quick, brief overview of catechism and our catechism. And so, of course, one way of thinking about the journey is the journey through the story of the church through time and how the church has used catechism. But also, I want us to take that journey metaphor beyond simply the timeline of history and into our own lives and our own faith journeys as well. So, back, we have our questions. So let's just start with the basics. This word, catechism. I mean, it's one word that we throw around. A lot of us grew up with that word being used whether we understood the word itself or not. Does anybody know where this word comes from? It does not come from the Roman Catholic Church. We may think it does. It doesn't. It predates. It is a Greek word. It comes from a Greek word that simply means teaching or learning by rote and by memorization. So the word catechism itself actually implies something that you learn orally by being taught and repeated back. The earliest Christians, of course, were living in something of secret to a certain extent. It was dangerous to be a Christian, and so as the letters of Paul and the epistles are being written, and a couple of decades later the Gospels begin to be written down, we have written accounts and written scriptures and teachings, but at the same time we also have a lot of the kind of nuts and bolts of belief being taught orally, not being written down, so that people have them committed to memory, so that even if they're in facing persecution or having to have their lives disrupted, they have those beliefs inside them, and they're not, they're not reliant only on a written word. As we see through time, though, part of that teaching oral method is almost sort of a Socratic thing, where question and answer. The teacher asks a question, the student has the answer ready to, and that's the way they memorize, is through learning the questions and answers. The early Christians adopted this method from their surrounding culture of the schools of philosophy. The Epicureans were a group of philosophers, a school of thought in the ancient world that used this method specifically almost like shorthand for all of their ways of looking at life. And some of the early Christians said, that's a great tool for us to use. Let's use it also. We'll hear the word catechumen. That refers to the person going through catechesis. And the catechumenate is sort of the collective noun as well as the process itself. So these words all mean focusing on the same thing. Specifically, this teaching was used to join the community of faith through baptism. And in the earliest centuries of the church, that process, does anybody know how long that process took? 3 months while you're waiting for the date for the bishop to show up, right? No. How long did this process take?
It was like years, right?
3 years. For the first 300, maybe even 400 years or so of the church, joining the church was a big deal. It was a 3-year commitment to go through. You can memorize a lot in 3 years, I think, if you set your mind to it. We do, though, start to see catechisms being written down, even in these early centuries. The earliest written catechism that the church has is included in what is known as the Didache, which is one of the earliest Christian writings that is not in the Bible, not in the New Testament. We're not sure exactly when it showed up, but sometime in the late decades of the first century, sometime between the year 70 and 110, in that ballpark. It includes a catechism for instruction leading to baptism. As we go forward in time, some of those early bishops, Cyril of Jerusalem and St. Basil of Caesarea, both writing in the late 300s, wrote texts to be used as catechisms for their congregations in their dioceses. And St. Augustine of Hippo, a few decades later in the early 400s, also wrote a catechism to be used. So we have both this unwritten oral tradition and written catechisms going hand in hand for people in churches to use. For this 3-year preparation for baptism, and even the way the worship services happened in those early centuries of the church, going probably up to about maybe not the 600s, but the first 400 or 500 years, people who were not yet baptized would not stay through the entire Eucharist service. They would sit together as a group through the sermon period that we have, and then where the Nicene Creed and the prayers of the people occurred, they would all get up and leave. They would actually be dismissed by the priest from the liturgy. And they would go to catechism class, and the rest of the community, the baptized part of the community, stayed for the prayers and the creed and the distribution of the Eucharist. So when these catechumens were ready to be baptized, they had to be examined by the bishop. They had to be ready to answer those questions for admission to baptism. I'm so sorry about this frog in my throat.
Do you want me to get you some water?
Sure. Thank you.
I trust you, Matthew, to carry that torch without me.
Okay. So we have now, let's fast forward quickly through time, although I'll just kind of have a side note to say, as we progress into what we call the Middle Ages, and infant baptism becomes more normative, around the year 500 or so.
One of these?
We're obviously not going to give a quiz to infants to examine them before they're baptized. This is where we start to see the tradition of godparents coming along. And godparents are invested with the role of teaching their godchildren the catechism. So it's not just I'm going to give you a present on your birthday, godfather, godmother, but actually I'm responsible for teaching these young baptized people in the stories of the faith. So now let's fast forward. We've got all these catechisms and all these traditions going through. Thank you so much. Let's zoom ahead to about the year 1519. And we have this guy. Does anyone recognize that lovely fellow there on the print? Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformations. Martin Luther loves the idea of catechism.
Is that the face you make when you're reciting the catechism?
That is the face that the bishop makes when they're listening to you give your answers. And Martin Luther thought this is a great tool that the church has, that the church has been using for centuries. Let's double down on it. He loved it so much that he wrote two. Very creatively, he called them the Long Catechism and the Short Catechism. Did anyone here grow up in the Lutheran church? Sometimes we get Lutherans renegade. But Lutherans to this day will talk about learning the Short Catechism as children. Luther wrote the Short Catechism for children, question and answer, and he wrote the Long Catechism for the teachers and parents to be able to explain the answers to the children from the short. So they went hand in hand along in the short. Martin Luther, this is what we were just talking, well, I'll fill in some of those gaps. This is what he inherited, both godparents and increasingly over time parents as well, teaching the children at home primarily, but also when they go to church. There would actually be times in places where the liturgy itself, the priest would come down and do a little bit of catechism. We see that before the Reformation, and we see it after the Reformation as well. What were they learning? By the time we get to the year 1500, it's focused on the Lord's Prayer, the creeds, Apostles' and or Nicene Creed, and the Ten Commandments. Those become the pillars and anchors for what is memorized and responded. Sometimes we will also get the Hail Mary, Ave Maria as a prayer to be memorized, and some questions and answers about the theology of the Eucharist. What is going on when we are observing and partaking in the Eucharist? We see the word catechism first in the 1300s, so it's a word that Luther knew. Luther emphasized, this is, I'm sure, not going to be a big surprise to anyone, his emphasis was not only on memorizing, but on understanding the words. Luther was the one who introduced to the formulas of question and answer, what does this mean? So not only are you expected to know the Ten Commandments off your heart, to recite the Creed off your heart and the Lord's Prayer, but also to be able to answer in those formula that are written down, what does it mean to honor your father and mother? What does it mean that he ascended to the right hand of the Father and will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead? Luther is emphasizing understanding, which then passes on to some of the other leaders in the Reformation. John Calvin wrote a catechism for the Genevan community, and he revised it a few times. We get lots of catechisms in lots of the branches of the Protestant groups. The early Baptists, believe it or not, actually had a catechism. That was something new that I learned. Early Anabaptist and Baptist communities had catechisms. The Roman Catholics saw what these Protestant reformers were doing and said, hey, we like that, and they're getting away from us. Let's reclaim this as our own. So we start to see more detailed, written down, explanatory catechisms in the Catholic Church as well as part of what's known as the Counter-Reformation. And in case we feel left out, the early leaders of the Anglican tradition in the Church of England also jumped on the catechism boat, big time. Primarily based in what Martin Luther was doing, some of the early, Thomas Cranmer, the author of the first Book of Common Prayer in 1549, loved catechisms. So he included in the very first prayer book a catechism, which, no surprise given the history of what people had been doing for hundreds of years, focused on the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Apostles' Creed. And it included, in that style of Luther, questions about what does this mean? Why do we use these words in these texts? And it was also, in that same tradition, part of the exam for confirmation by the bishop. The bishop could quiz and examine the confirmands on these elements. There were set in the catechism, the set questions that are in the prayer book are the ones that would be asked, and the student, the catechumen, would recite the answer. We see this in every prayer book, beginning in 1549, all the way through. Now, what we see over time is that it actually gets a little bit longer. The second prayer book in 1552, which had more of a Genevan Calvinist influence, included more content about theology, more content about what the Eucharist means, more content about how the church is structured. In 1604, when King James came along and became the King of England, they gently revised the 1559 prayer book and added more that's one of the main differences in 1604 is a longer catechism, which is still included in the confirmation section of the prayer book. Through our own American Episcopal Church 1928 prayer book, it is basically the same catechism. It's the same questions, the same answers, very gently revised, but you can draw a direct line all the way back to 1549. Some of the phrasings are the same. And the content, even though it's been gently enlarged to include more things, is basically the same all the way back. Now, the 1928 book, and who here grew up with the 1928 prayer book as a child? Do you remember a section in that 28 book that's called an Office of Instruction? It's very interesting. This is the only prayer book that did this. And the 79 prayer book did something interesting with it that we'll get to. But what this is, the catechism is in the 1928 prayer book twice in two different places. It was called the catechism. It was actually moved to the back for the first time. But in its place, right before the rite of confirmation, a new worship service was added called an Office of Instruction. It includes almost verbatim the same stuff that are in the catechism, but it's put in the context of a worship service different from confirmation. It includes prayers, and it'll say things like, here you will sing a hymn. Here the priest will offer a brief homily. Then there's this questions and answers. So the idea was that teaching and learning the catechism was best done in the context of prayer and worship. It's a very interesting thing. And then in the back, there's the straight-up catechism without those added things. So now we get to our current 1979 prayer book.
Can we back up just a second?
Yeah, of course.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. So confirmands could be examined by the bishop. Mm-hmm. And I'm picturing people coming forward to be confirmed by the bishop in the context of the liturgy. Mm-hmm. And at that time would be only adults, because confirmation was something that shifted. Adulthood was something that was kind of put forward.
In these years, it would actually have been not unlike what we do here, teenagers.
Oh, really?
Children and teenagers.
Okay.
Some adults, yes, also.
Here's my question, and I say this as a person, I'm a very smart person, but I did not always test well as a child. Like, EOGs were not always my favorite thing. And there was I think there has always been an attitude in education of if you know it, and if you don't, you don't. And I am glad to see that that is shifting with our generation. But let's say I am a confirmand in 1604, and I'm in front of the bishop, and the bishop is like, give me the theology of the Trinity, and I'm like, oh, I know it, but I don't know how to, I don't know how to, and the memorization just, can you fail as a confirmand? Would the bishop be like, you're out, I'm not going to confirm you?
Well, anyone here who grew up with that 1604 confirmation, did you have peers in your confirmation group who couldn't remember the answer to the question in that moment? Are there any stories? I mean, I think what would happen is, number one, because all education was structured on this method, all education was reciting things. Even math and languages were taught that way. So on the one hand, the expectation was, a child or a teenager or whoever would just get up and say it. And of course, there are times when someone's words fail them and they forget in the moment, they're stressed out or whatever. That's a very good question.
I'm just really struck by the right and the wrong of this, and how we don't always know the answer. We don't always remember what we were taught.
Right.
And we like to have that kind of emphasis and to have that relationship with the bishop, as the bishop is the one that evaluates whether you are right or wrong.
Here's what happens. Usually, in most contexts, you would not be individually standing up and answering these questions on your own.
Oh.
That's how you were taught when you were instructed. Every student during class would have to say it themselves.
But like as a group?
But then, in the actual liturgy of confirmation, they would all say it together. And we all know from experience, how much easier is it to say the Nicene Creed during the church service when everybody's saying it around us, versus if you try to say it at home by yourself? Which one's easier? And you've practiced it. Yeah, you've practiced it a lot. And you've got your friends doing it along with you. And hopefully you have a nice bishop who is doing this and mouthing the words as you go. Not every bishop is like that. Some are stern, checking off every comma.
That's really comforting to think about an entire group.
It's a group.
And it really kind of emphasizes we believe together.
Community. Even, Dixon, you had your hand up.
Randomly going to call on, That's right.
Yeah. Right. And at worst case scenario, they say, well, next year. Worst case scenario, next year. Yeah. Right.
Try
again. So, all right, that's a very good, but I'm glad we had that little sidebar. All right. 1979 prayer book. You've got it in your hands. We're on page 844. So right off the bat, where is the Catechism? In the back. It's not next to the confirmation service. It's in the back, which there is precedent for in 28, sort of. But the other interesting thing, what's the big, large typeface title? Does it say the Catechism or a Catechism? No, it's a different title, an outline of the faith, commonly called the Catechism. So, in the spirit of what's going on in the 1979 prayer book of doing, this is work that started in the 28 prayer book, and the 79 comes along and kind of completes that work of doing an overhaul of lots of things, shining a flashlight into all these little dark corners to try to put a new shine on things and overhaul everything. For the first time in the history of Episcopal Church Anglican prayer books, the common old questions are taken out and replaced with new questions. The language is updated to contemporary wording and phraseology. And even though we've seen these gradual enlargements of the Catechism, this is way longer than any Anglican prayer book catechism that came before it. Now, what's interesting is, at its core, the same basic nuggets of the foundation of what the Catechism includes are still here. It is still grounded in the Ten Commandments and the Creed. The Lord's Prayer actually is not as emphasized here as it has been in previous prayer books, catechisms. But the Ten Commandments and the Creed are still front and center. And that traditional question and answer format, even though the questions have changed, the format of question and answer is still there. It's still Epicurean in its origin. Yes? Well, I'm glad you said that. Yeah. It's very different. Yeah. Exactly. So we're not the only ones who have lengthened our catechism. The Roman Catechism is also a 20th century product. Yeah. That is an excellent question. You know, can I hold that question and come back to it? Because that is an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it very much. Many people ask that question. So we'll get to that. And remind me if I forget about it, because I do want to get back to that in the context of this too. Yeah, the current Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, like you said, 700 some pages. It's enormous. It was not like that in the year 1300 or even the year 1500. In light of all the things that lots of churches were doing in the 20th century, and the Roman Catholic Church revises its catechism every few decades. So the current one they're using now is not that old, but it also is, it's very explanatory. It goes into very specific, detailed depth about lots of topics. What exactly happens when the priest breaks the host? I mean, those kind of questions. Our catechism doesn't do that. It also has footnotes, that's right. Our catechism, and part of what we'll get to, is to say that it's intentional that this catechism is so short by comparison. But let's think about that 1928 Office of Instruction, and on page 844, where it says concerning, and the small print, it tells us something very interesting. It says, it may also be used to form a simple service. Since the matter is arranged under headings, it is suitable for selective use, and the leader may introduce prayers and hymns as needed. So here's a little kind of faint ghost of that Office of Instruction from 1928, that this can be a worship service. This can be a liturgy, Dixon. Next Sunday morning, we can have an outline of the faith. I will say, has anyone here ever been, in any Episcopal church ever, to a service where this was a worship service? I have not. And I do not know the answer to the question, how often might that actually be done? But we were given permission to do it, which is very interesting. It was not invented out of whole cloth. There were two main sources of inspiration for the way we have it here now. The first was the Church of England in 1928, and then revised in 1962, a revised catechism, so-called. Then, in 1973, the same people who are responsible for this book, the Standing Commission on Liturgy, crafted a revised catechism, and they kind of meshed those two sources together to give us what we have here. And here is how, above that thing about how it can be a worship service, we're given this. It is a commentary on the creeds, but is not meant to be a complete statement of belief and practice, but to provide a brief summary of the church's teaching for an inquiring stranger. It's almost like they knew somebody was going to say, well, wait, the Roman Catholic Catechism is so different and more detailed. And they were preparing for that they prepared for that question by having that statement. It was intentionally set to be different. It was intentionally set to be open-ended and to not be a destination point to answer every question, but to be a starting point and springboard for, in fact, asking more questions. So it's very interesting that this document is in question and answer format, and the answers themselves are not very detailed all the time. They're intentionally, maybe a little frustratingly vague for some people, and for other people, they may be refreshingly vague. What does that sound like?
Anglican.
Anglicanism. It sounds a lot like Dixon's lecture on the Anglican ethos to me. It sounds like Tinker Toys at work, trying to encompass different entry points, different angles, different ways of understanding belief and the life of faith. So, there are set statements of belief about God, about sin, salvation, the Trinity, who Jesus is, what the church is, what baptism and Eucharist are. They are here. And we can go to this and say, we have set firm beliefs. You might even want to use the word doctrine, and I will argue that that's okay. That's an okay word for us to use. This is our doctrine. This whole book is our doctrine. But it's not 792 pages with footnotes. It is not excruciatingly detailed. This is not a book. If the life of faith were a car, you could not get this thing on the highway and get very far in it. But if it is a boat on the ocean, it will get us across without sinking. How about that? I just thought of that. I don't know if it works. But that's a very good. What is the answer to that question? Where is that book for us?
I mean, I don't believe that there is anything like that, but the the identity of the Anglican tradition as it is in the history of the prayer books and in the ways that our liturgy has been shaped is really where that 700, like all the different nuances of theology that are taught in prayer and in worship, is how that emerges. That's not the direct answer you're looking for, but like that's what I would point to.
Yeah.
Daniel has an answer? Or another question? That's really well said.
It's very well said, and I think that also points to why the emphasis on memorization and recitation is really downplayed. I mean, those of us who have been to a confirmation service since this prayer book has been in use, that's not part of it. There are other questions, and there are other answers, but those questions and answers that we have now are more in line with how will you live your life struggling with the questions? How will you orient yourself? Now, let me ask this question. I see a raised hand, but let me ask you a question first. Do you think we have lost anything by downplaying, memorizing certain things like the Ten Commandments or the Lord's Prayer or the text of the Creed and having that? I'm not asking that with any bias. I'm simply asking it as a question. Do you think something has been lost in so much downplaying that element?
Yeah.
Okay. Jeannie? It's more contextual. That's a great answer. And I think that's really the spirit of the 79 too, is that as we repeat these words, we learn them more gently almost. And they're really on our hearts. Okay, yes. Yeah, and we don't have that. Yeah. Well, of course, I'm sure we could all make a list. Yeah, that's right. Praying shapes believing, and it really writes. Yeah,
And I think about like kind of what Daniel was saying about the words that we say about God and to God are really captured really well in our collects. Like the collect of the day that we pray, it changes every single Sunday. We have special ones for special days in the church calendar, and they each say something different about God. Like they're prayers. They are the prayers of our hearts to God, but they are also theological statements. And there's something about that as complementary to a catechism that is shaped by the community praying it together. Yeah.
well, so here are all these subjects that our catechism does cover in excruciatingly vague detail. How about that? But I do invite you to take time, explore this section of the prayer book, and we're going to hand it back over to Sarah.
Oh, yeah?
So what? How can we use this?
That's always the question I'm asking. It's
Yeah.
like the so what? Like, why is this taking up space in the prayer book? Why did we spill ink over this? What do we use it for?
Yeah.
And this is the first time, and I've been an Episcopalian for, 16 years. I've been a priest for 12. And this is the first time, even all through seminary, that I've ever had a class or a conversation about the catechism. Dixon is nodding. Is that true for you too? But yeah, like this is something that we have taken up space with, and I think it's important for us to explore some ways that we could maybe use it every once in a while.
Yeah.
Mark mentioned worship, but I had a few bullet points. And I spend a lot of time with people who are new to the Episcopal Church. I do confirmation classes, and I work with welcome and newcomers. And there are people that will kind of come from another denomination, having been pretty active in the church they came from, that maybe dictated what they believed about certain things, and they come with this energy of like, what does the Episcopal Church say about da-da-da-da-da? And this is a tool, if you find yourself in that kind of conversation, this is a tool to use for that sort of like, I don't know. But you might find it, to Mark's point about how like kind of broad and vague it can be, it will not, like one of the questions that I got as a leader of newcomers many times is, what does the Episcopal Church believe about the Virgin Mary? Lots of former Catholics, I think, want to know like what is our belief about this thing. You're not going to find that answer in the Catechism.
We mean that by God's own act, his divine Son received our human nature from the Virgin Mary, his mother. That's it.
I mean, that's
what we get.
That's what we get. Yeah. And I think that can be, as we have written up here, a doorway for conversation, but not a kind of explicit, here's how we believe this whole thing is structured, what we believe specifically about the Virgin Mary. We've talked about the beauty of the collects, but this can actually, the catechism itself can be a conversation partner and a place for meditation and prayer. That we could look at some of these bullet points and some of these questions that are being asked as how do we connect with God in prayer? I was really looking at this first section on human nature, and I really love this, this last question at the bottom of the page, 845. How did God first help us? God first helped us by revealing himself in his will through nature and history, through many seers and saints, and especially through the prophets of Israel. And I just kind of liked that as an entry point for prayer. Seeing myself as a person who's, sitting down and wanting to pray and asking God for help with something and saying, on whose shoulders do I stand? There are many people that have gone before me. There's many ways that God has helped other people in the past, and to meditate on those seers and saints and the prophets of Israel. That sounds like prayer to me, or at least an entry point to it. So I wanted to just bring that up. Can serve as an anchor or a guidepost representing what the church holds to be true and teaches about God, life, and faith. And then next one gives us a starting point to ask our own questions. I really love, and as you can kind of see in the way that I dialogue with Mark, I like relationships where I can argue, or at least I can kind of push back a little bit to what people say. And I like very much that having this in our prayer book invites that kind of relationship with God. If you are a person who has questions from time to time, who maybe wonders about what is it that God is even up to in a world that seems to be kind of like a mess, a catechism can be a place to stand, and a place that says it's okay to dialogue with God and to have this kind of rapport with God that is pushing and testing and questioning a little bit. I think that that's a good way for us to ask some of our own questions. You might have found today's seminar more frustrating than it was kind of settling into one place, and that's good. We are leaving you with this being open-ended because that's what the Catechism is. It provides us some places where we can hold out belief and ask the good questions and continue to, in our life of faith, live those questions. So I hope that you've enjoyed this kind of very brief explanation of this. Mark referenced Dixon's confirmation lecture on the Anglican ethos. Do y'all know what he was talking about? Some of you who've been in confirmation recently might remember, but all of the confirmation lectures we have filmed. This was something we did in 2020 when we couldn't be together. So all of the lectures are filmed, and Dixon starts off the whole series with a lecture about what he calls the Anglican ethos, which is what we have been kind of dancing around talking about today. I invite you to just, you could take your phone and take a photo of this so you get the web address to look up Dixon's confirmation lecture.
You have to memorize that to recite those numbers.
That's right. Back to memorization. If you want to watch it, it's very fun and engaging, as Dixon is, and I think he actually takes out the Tinker Toys to set up his X and Y and Z axis to explain the whole thing. But it's a really good way of understanding the way that Anglicans do theology, the way that we engage with this whole thing, which is not in the Catholic way of the straight line to the question and the answer, but the question that leads to the bigger, expansive, broad view. And what's that final? How might a reminder of this ethos influence our understanding of the Prayer Book Catechism? To watch that video with this sense of how might I look at the Catechism knowing that this is how Anglicans do theology. So that's kind of your piece to take with you as you go. So, any final thoughts?
Well, I know you've got to go get ready for the 11:15, and folks who are headed to the 11:15 service, thank you all very much. If anyone would like to stay in the weeds and talk about the Athanasian Creed for a couple of minutes, I'm of course happy to do that. But thank you all very much. Sarah, thank you. Great.